Hello, my name is Aura, and our group will explain about Australia foreign policy with the case study of West Papua immigration policy in 2006. Before I get into the foreign policy, I will explain a little bit about how Australia is. Australia is defined as continental state which is situated in south hemisphere of Pacific Ocean and also considered as biggest territory in the Oceania that generally dominated by the archipelagic states. Thus, according to the geographical situations that Australia is facing on, Australia also deemed as an isolated western and misplaced territory where the discourse indicates Australia still perceived as a western bloc that frequently linked to the United States and European, in which laden toward the conservative and neoliberalistic, while situated in the low proximity towards the west and instead neighboring with the non-western states such as Asian and Melanesian. Australia's foreign policy component also had several alterations of orientations, points where Australia is now having a two distinctive mascot. First, Australia considered itself politically and culturally as a Western society as adopted by United States and the UK. Secondly, Australia also creates a collective conditions with its non-Western states in form of adaptive foreign policy approach adjusted with the socio-geographical and condition in order to maintain their cooperation with the non-Western neighbor, as stated in quotations looking at security inside the Asia quotations. As the distance between Australia and other Asian countries becomes a new wave diplomatic distance development, therefore, since the declarations of Statute of Westminster in 1931, Australia had already gained their independence in managing its political, including the foreign affairs, as Commonwealth state, despite the relations with the UK still strongly built until now, as a close colleague, not dominion region. Specifically, Australia has normal function as a foreign state in regulating its foreign affairs named DFAT that independently formed in 1986 with the goal on international trade diplomacy. As a parliamentary democratic state, Australia also owns its procedural of foreign policy making, where the foreign policy is made through DFAT under the direct responsibility of Prime Minister as the supreme authority in the Commonwealth system.
So guys, after we heard a glimpse about how the Australian government conduct their foreign policy making under the DFAT as a forum, we will briefly explain our study case about West Papua immigration issues among Indonesia and Australia in 2006. So, in the case about our study case, the conflict between Australia and Indonesia is really emanated from the 1969 when the West Papua under the Dutch is really confronted by Indonesia, who wants to make Papua as a part of Indonesian territory. Australia at that time is decided with the Dutch side, so the conflict between Indonesia and Australia indirectly happened during that time. But the UN actually warned Indonesia under the UNTEA as the resolution, which bring back Papua as an Indonesian part. That's why they called Irian. Then, in the contemporary era, the conflict between Indonesia and Australia is really strengthened because of immigration policy that used by Australian government to accept about 42 asylum seekers from West Papua. So the conflict happened because Indonesian government sees that these actions really a propaganda of liberations. But actually what Australian government did is not about the propaganda. but it's only about the humanity, because the human right issues that really thrive and really develop inside the Australian policy, who is accepting all the refugees as long as they in legal way. So under the John Howard administrations, the Australian really accept the 42 West Papuan refugees who escaped from Indonesia. So the study case said that because of these actions, Indonesian and Australian really in a separated way of the diplomatic relationship. So in this case, Australia really using the two kind of mascot. The liberal mascot of the first mascot of Western is about the human right issues on refugee policy that used by Australia to accept all the refugees all around the world who seek a rescue mission, who wants to a safety place to stay, and Australia provide them very well. But because in the second mascot, Australia need to readjust. Australia not only make a kind of resolution, but also in the diplomatic ways in which Australia respect Indonesia's sovereignty in this treaty to enhance economic and security cooperation by rejecting all kind of provocative asylum seeker, especially from Papua or maybe a criminal from both countries that could endanger both party if it is violated.
So, we're going to talk about John Howard and the Australian foreign policy making. In making the foreign policy, Australia has plenty of analysis objectives, including the calculation from inside and outside the state in forms of information. Therefore, the government needs a bureaucracy assistance in making that certain prescription for complying the national interests. In this case, the most prominent bureaucracy for Australia foreign policy making is delegated in DFTA, or the Department of Foreign and Trade Affairs, which operate two objectives in tandem, as Australia really care about her economic and national security, since the misplaced situation with non-Western neighbors starts to preoccupy the politicians. In making the decisions, the most dominant actors are played the executive ones, such as the Prime Minister and his sub-ministries. And in the case of John Howard, the foreign policy orientation really reflected by the leadership style and social culture that ingrained by the actor, which simultaneously shapes his behavior in grasping the international situation. Secondly, we can see that the parliamentary actor could determine the foreign policy, although they got a minor dominance compared than executive through Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense, which actually could urge some executive in implementing and prioritizing some foreign policies. Third, the political party also determines the wave of foreign policy based on the ideology that empowers them organizationally. In Australia, there are two dominant parties, the Labour Party and the Liberal National Party, which had a different stance for their objective. In John Howard's case, the National Liberal Party partially determines the behavior of him as a liberal conservative in prioritizing the liberal meaning of Australia in terms of a strategic national security, in preventing the terrorism and illicit immigrant, while at the same time enforcing the human rights and uphold the legal migration under the qualified reasons and requirements.
Before we move on to the conclusion part, we would like to add some small quiz section to the video. And now we have one question to tackle coming from our fellow student, Ramiza Gali. Thank you for your question, Ramiza. And yeah, his question is, what will Indonesia-Australia relations in the future? Yeah, so in conclusion, we agree that the geographical background is a big problem for Australia, because they are almost in every aspect closer to the Western states. I think we've mentioned about this before, like culturally, economically, politically, Even their race and so on are more similar to Western countries. However, due to the geographical condition, they are neighboring with Asian countries instead. And yeah, thus we believe several adjustments have to be made by Australia, because in the fact that they could adapt with any aspects they wanted, but that would not be able to run away from the fact that they are still neighboring with Asian countries that are actually truly diverse with them. Yeah, so in that case, we believe that Australia will have to come up with a solution that could cope with both situations. Thank you.